Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second annual Rhina Espaillat Poetry Award ceremony. My name is Sam Hine, and I'm one of the editors of Plough Quarterly magazine. If you're not already a member of the Plough family and a subscriber, I urge you to become one. There should be some information in the chat. Our summer issue mails tomorrow, and it includes the winning poems by the poets that you will meet tonight. This award honors the achievements of the great Dominican-American poet, translator, and public school teacher, Rhina Espaillat. It is awarded for an original poem of not more than 50 lines that reflects Rhina's lyricism, empathy, and ability to find grace in everyday events of life. The winning poet receives $2,000 and two finalists receive $250. This year, the contest attracted over 750 poems, including many by our subscribers and more than a few by some of America's most esteemed poets. Judging was blind. Plough's poetry editor, A.M. Juster, selected what he considered to be the 15 best poems, from which the editors collaboratively chose the top 3. For those of you watching who participated in our contest, I want to thank you and invite you to try again in next year's contest, which is now open. If you subscribe to Plough Quarterly, there's no entry fee. I was just virtually backstage with Rhina and Mr. Juster and the 3 winners who happen to span 10 time zones. So I want to thank you for joining us at this hour. I also want to take a moment to honor the memory of one of last year's winners, Susan de Sola of the Netherlands, who died of cancer in October. Now I'd like to introduce our Master of Ceremonies. A.M. Juster is a poet, translator, and essayist. Before advancing to his current position as Plough Poetry Editor, he worked in senior positions for 4 US presidents, among other things as a Commissioner of Social Security. His most recent book of poetry is Wonder and Wrath, and he is currently working on a translation of Petrarch's Canzoniere. Thank you, Mike, for everything you've done to build this community of poets and poetry lovers.
Sam, thank you. And thank you, Plough, for sponsoring this award and for the attention that the editors put into this selection, which is really quite impressive. I have the brain dead easiest job tonight, which is introducing my friend and mentor, Rhina Espaillat. And if there's anyone who needs no introduction, it's Rhina. But on the off chance that you are not adequately informed, in my view, she's the greatest poet to ever come out of the Dominican Republic. She's a superb translator, in addition to an original poet, the finest to bring Richard Wilbur and Robert Frost into English, to Spanish, to bring Sor Juana into English, and the winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize, the Richard Wilbur Award, and twice the Howard Nemeroff Sonnet Award. I could go on and on about 20 books? I've lost track.
I'm working on the 18th.
18th, okay. But really just a force of nature in the poetry world and a force of good nature. And it's a real honor to be with her today. And I'd like to ask her to kick this off by reading one of her sonnets.
Okay. I want to thank Plough and Sam Hine, who has all the patience in the world dealing with me on email. And I want to thank this gentleman next to me right here, because he is all heart. No, he's not all heart. He's all heart and all brain at the same time. This is called Butchering. And I'm reading this one because it reminds me of the 3 poems that I had the pleasure of reading, and I have read many times now, the 3 poems that have won this contest. It's about a human being. It's about human life. And that's what touches me most. That's what matters to me. Butchering, and it's a true story. My mother's mother, toughened by the farm, hardened by infants' burials, used a knife and swung an axe as if her woman's arm wielded a man's hard will. Inured to life and death alike, what ails you now, she'd say ungently to the sick. She fed them too, roughly but well, and took the blood away, and washed the dead, if there was that to do. She told us children how the cows could sense when their own calves were marked for butchering, and how they lowed, their wordless eloquence impossible to still with anything, sweet clover or her unremitting care. She told it simply, but she faltered there. Oh,
Very nice, very nice. So I do want to thank you all for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have an audience for these great poets. I do just want to add about the contest. In some places, I know there's cynicism about these contests. We have a staff person at Plough that worked very hard to make all of the submissions anonymous. I read all 750 of them this year, read every single one. And I do a rough cut down to about 50. And then I read all those at least 2 more times, and then try to get it down to between 15 and 20, which is what I did this year, and then pass it on to the editors. Last year, I joined, although I tried to be a little bit in the background with the general discussion about the poems. I'm just really impressed with the love of poetry and the care and attention that the editors pay to this, and the respectful way in which they debate. It's really extraordinary. I'm not used to seeing that kind of thing. So they really do a terrific job. I missed it this year. We had a family medical emergency, so I did not sit in this year, but I'm sure it was pretty much the way it was last year. And it was it's a great thing in poetry to see it done so well and so professionally. So let me move on to the first of our winners today. It's Eric Rasher, who is, it's past 3 in the morning for him in Latvia. Eric was born in Akron, Ohio. He teaches English now in Latvia. He's the author of a chapbook of poetry, 5 Functions Defined on Experience for J. Wright, and his work has appeared in or is forthcoming in Poetica, Drake, and Maximus. And Eric has a sonnet that he would like to read for us. Eric?
All right, thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank everyone involved in this event tonight. Sam Hine, of course, and the editorial board at Plough, and everyone involved in this. Of course, A.M. Juster as well, Juster, for having selected my poem as one of the shortlist poems. And also congratulations to Sherry Shanuda and Bruce Bennett as well. So I will read my poem. The title is Sonnet Addressed to George Oppen, Arlington National Cemetery. I think of the dead, the disposition of the grave, the marble here arrayed. I've found my words to be but parodies of sound or parodies of silence, and above all else, perhaps, mere parodies of love. The heartlessness of words you wrote, you, bound, as I, lies in their opacity. We sound their depths, the force of clarity, a covenant. Over by the mall, the cherry trees are finishing their dance, and the monuments are softened by the scent of fading blooms. Our wounded earth is flooded with a sea of petals that flick and flutter as they're spent. Her broad back bends beneath their soft perfume. And since I was asked to say maybe a little bit about the writing of this poem, I would only say that I've been working on this poem for many years, for nearly 18 years. And it's taken many, many different forms, sort of all revolving around the central image of the sestet of the petals of the cherry blossoms falling to the earth. And it was only just a few days before the deadline for this, for submitting to this award, that I worked it into the form that it has now, and what I think is the final form. So thank you once again.
Poem, and then Rhina's going to chip in with anything that she wants to add. Sam mentioned that I've translated now over 300 of Petrarch's sonnets, so I'm very attuned on the form, and I know better than most people it's a difficult one, and it requires in the octet 2 groups of 4 rhymes, and particularly getting that 4th rhyme right is very difficult. I had a friend, Catherine Tufariello, who used to translate these with me, and we always refer to the 4th rhyme problem. And there's a very real interesting 4th rhyme here in this one, because Eric picked a fairly difficult rhyme that starts of, above, and then love, and there's not a lot left that rhymes with those words, and they're not that interesting. I mean, dove, glove, shove, what was Eric going to do? But then he did something that really caught my eye, is he took a technique that started really with E. Cummings, I guess in the 1930s probably, became very popular in the 60s, which was to get a rhyme to break up a word with a hyphen. And that's what he does with the word covenant. And my first reaction, because that's a technique that's a lot of favor, I said, well, how do I feel about that? And then all of a sudden, kind of my head snapped back, and I said, I'm literally looking at a broken covenant. You know, he has taken the word covenant and broken it, and the whole idea of a broken covenant is a very important part of the subtext of this poem. And so I said, God, I'm embarrassed I didn't even see that right away. I thought it was really quite brilliant. And it's a linchpin for the poem. Not everyone may be familiar with George Oppen. He was a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s, but then he went on to fight for our country during World War II, and he won a Purple Heart, which is how this poem gets set at Arlington National Cemetery. But despite his Purple Heart, Oppen faced difficulties after the war due to his communist affiliation, and he went into self-exile for 9 years, returned eventually to the United States, and won many major awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in 1969. And, you know, while it's tempting to call this poem an elegy, it really isn't. It's really not so much about George Oppen the way most poems about the dead are about the dead person. The poet is really speaking to the dead poet, and it makes the poem much more about him, and it makes it a meditation on monuments, on mortality, and the difficulty of giving words the power that George Oppen was famous for insisting upon. So in brief, it's a beautiful and powerful poem, and I congratulate Eric on it. Rhina?
What I like about this poem very much is that it climbs into its theme backward, because it begins with a kind of self-criticism, kind of complaint. The voice of the poem seems to be saying, these words that I'm using are not right. They're parodies of something that has value, but they're not really the same thing. And this is a feeling that I'm familiar with, because poetry, after all, uses only the one medium, which is words, language. And sometimes you can't get what matters most to you into language. And I love the way this poem begins with that self-doubt, that mea culpa thing about not having said it the way I would have liked to, and then going on to nature. And it's as if you were saying in this poem, look at how the cherry trees finish their dance, how they are dancing, their feeling about this event, about all these deaths of young people who have died for the country. And then the monuments softened. The idea of marble softening because of an odor is absolutely marvelous. That sestet is marvelous for its images. And then the earth, finally, you have made a list of mourners in this poem. And at the end, it's the planet itself that is mourning for the dead. And that's a beautiful thought. Our wounded earth is flooding with a sea of petals. And then her broad back, it's as if she were overcome completely, as if the earth were overcome with sorrow. And over what? Over the soft perfume. So I like the way imagery has been used in the poem. I like the fact that I think 8 out of the 14 lines are not ended, not hard ended, but wraparounds. And I love that because it has the thought of, it has the feeling of meditation, of inner thought. You're speaking to Oppen, but you're also speaking to yourself, to your own sense of aesthetics, and to your own sense of what grieving ought to feel like, and how short language is, how ineffective words are to bring the feeling to it that we all want to. I love this poem. In the middle, I came across one word that confused me for a second, and that was bound. I said, bound. And then I realized, oh, he's linking the two poems, of course. They're bound because their words are in books. But it's a pun, because they're also bound to language. That's what we're all stuck with. And I thought that was not only clever, but profound.
All right, well, we could keep going, but
Yes.
if we don't, we'll steal time from the others. And so the next one up is Sherry Shenouda, who is an Egyptian-American poet and pediatrician born in Cairo and now living near Los Angeles. She won the 2021 Silverman First Book Prize for African Poets for her poetry collection, Mummy Eaters, and was shortlisted for the 2019 Brunel International African Poetry Prize, which I can tell you one of the little sub areas that I try to focus on in my Twitter site at AM Juster is African poetry, which gets almost no attention here in the United States. And I can tell you that that's arguably the top prize for African poets. So it's a great recognition of her work. She's also the author of a novel and serves in a nonprofit healthcare center and has studied the effects of armed conflict on child health. She says her Coptic Orthodox Christian faith informs her practice of medicine, and her practice of medicine informs her faith, and both inform her writing. So, Sherry.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here with you all, and the poetry of Rhina Espaillat has touched my heart in so many ways and has changed my relationship, as I shared with her, with some of my family members. So it really is an honor to be here. This poem is about my father, and he was sharing beautiful memories that he had of his childhood growing up in Cairo with my son, who was about 4 or 5 at the time. So this is called Sugarcane Memories. When I ask him to cut asab, he hesitates, then shudders it gone. He pulls a stalk away, shows his grandson how to stomp it down, crack the stalk at the base so the roots keep growing, shows him oud, musical knuckle of root band, bud furrow, and leaf scar. Canines tear and molars grind. We tongue the sweet sting, spit pulp, and pluck string, while he tells us how neighborhood kids spun quarters and whacked them with a stick of asab. Whoever stuck the spinning quarter got to keep it. The quarter or the cane, I ask, and he laughs. Then I grew up. He holds the asab along one forearm like an offered prayer, drives the knife down, peels down the purple-green stalk, and spins one about fallahin who were sucking sugarcane, telling stories all night, couldn't find their canes, and had to hobble home in the morning, and he laughs, and we laugh hard as the year. When I ask if I can help, he shakes his head, because he once drove a knife down into his forearm cutting asab, and his memory of sweetness with pain is long and long as the sugar cane.
Thank you, Sherry. So, like last year's winning poem and so much of Rhina's work, this is a poem that opens windows into another time and another culture. It's different from last year's winner in that it's stylistically, it's a poem with a more relaxed, more conversational free verse. But it would be a mistake to think that's all that there is going on here, because she clearly has command of the traditional poet's toolbox, which is she's most likely to move, from what I can see, when she's moving from a narrative to a lyrical mode. So as an example, consider the opening of the second stanza, which I'm going to take the liberty of reading again. I should probably ask her to do it, but I'll do it myself. Be a little bit more violent when I do it. Canines tear and molars grind. We tongue the sweet sting, spit pulp, and pluck string while he tells us. And then it goes on from there. And I just, wanted to know all these things that are going on. So she's moving that first line. It's headless iambic pentameter, which gives it some of the stateliness associated with that meter. But because it's headless, there's more stress per syllable than there is in traditional iambic pentameter. So it gives it a little bit more intensity. And then you've got a 10-syllable line, but it breaks away from meter entirely. And it's got arguably 3 spondies where you've got 2 little phrases that have the equal stress, and it slows things down and it makes a pounding, which is exactly what she's trying to do and get you to feel. And she's intensified it by stripping out the conjunctions, the prepositions, the adverbs, and the articles. And then this line too, there's such concentrated alliteration. And you listen to the S's and the plosive P's with sweet sting, spit pulp, and pluck string. And particularly, one of my favorite words, almost automatic pique is pulp. And she enhances the musicality of this line too with internal rhyme that you might not even hear, but it's got sting and string. And to show that rhyme's not an accident, she does something subtle in the last 2 lines, which I've seen a few of the best of the formal poets of our time do, which is to kind of sneak a couplet in at the end. And so the last word in the poem rhymes with the third to last word in the previous line. And if you're looking at the page, you don't see it pretty much. I certainly didn't see it the first time I read it. But you do hear it if you listen to it. So if you hear, and his memory of sweetness with pain is long and long, as long as the sugar cane. The cane and the pain, it's a very beautiful way of bringing closure to what is a very moving poem.
Yes.
Rhina.
Well, what I love about this poem, among many things, all of what Mike mentioned, but also the focus on the human being, the focus on the man, his work, the things, the tools that are used, the knife itself, the way he cuts. It's as if he were giving us a kind of a lesson in how to cut sugarcane. He's teaching us something. He's teaching us something about his life, what he has spent his time doing on this planet. I also love, as Mike mentioned, all the violent, almost violent these verbs: shudder and pull and crack and stomp. Stomp is wonderful. And so much whack. I have never come across a serious poem with whacked in it, but it works here. It worked because this is a worker's poem and he is doing what he does on the job. I love that. And then I like the fact that he stops for one moment and he says, "Then I grew up." And it's as if he were taking another step into the lesson he's giving about how this kind of work will not only make a living for you, but it will teach you things. It will teach you things about life, namely the fact that that the product of work involves sacrifice and risk. And his memory of sweetness with pain grabbed me immediately because that's a reality. That's a reality. It happens all the time. I like the quick view of the worker when they're not at work. In the third stanza, they're sucking sugarcane all night. I happen to come from the tropics, from the Dominican Republic. I know a little bit about sucking sugarcane. I used to do it as a child. And this really reached me. It reached me because it says, these are people who also know how to play, how to waste time, like all the rest of us. I love it because it's a human poem.
Okay, so got a little bit disorganized here. So the winner of the big prize is Bruce Bennett, who Rhina and I both know well. He's a retired professor of English at Wells College. He has the distinction of having been a co-founder of two of the most prestigious literary journals in this country, Ploughshares and Field. He has numerous books. He's known also perhaps almost as much as a poet of humor as a poet of serious verse, but certainly as a master of form. With no more ado, Bruce, read us the winner.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I really admire the other poems, and of course being with Mike and Rhina is always a pleasure. I decided to actually give the context of my poem first rather than read it first. I hope that's okay. But I wanted to give a little introduction to my mother, since that's what this poem is about. About a year and a half ago, almost 20 years after her death at the age of 96, I started to write sonnets about my mother. I now have 11 of them, and I have put them together under the title Love Letters to My Mother, which form the first part of a chapbook I'm currently sending around. They are all more or less on the light side, because my mother, in addition to being a wonderfully supportive mother, was something of a character, and most of the time had a great sense of humor. As a result, she was the source of countless family stories, which would take up all of our time if I got into telling them. But she was other things as well. She wrote poetry when she was young, and it was so similar to my early poetry that when we found a notebook of hers containing it, I thought it might have been mine. She was born in 1907 in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she remembered Robert Frost around her father's store when she was a child. I used to tease her about sitting on his knee, though neither of us knew whether that was true. She also remembered Madame Bianchi, Emily Dickinson's niece, walking around town in Amherst, and the things the townspeople said about her because she had been romantically involved with a Frenchman. I could go on, but I won't. Let me just add that in many ways, both good and maybe not so good, I have always recognized that my mother and I are very similar. In fact, one of my sonnets is entitled Our Kind. This is called Stopping By with Flowers. I used to bring back flowers for my mother. I'd stop the car and gather a small bunch. She'd always be surprised and always grateful. She'd put them in a vase. Could we have lunch? I wasn't free, but that part did not matter so much, I told myself. It was the thought. She loved my stopping by for those few minutes. Still, I'd feel guilty, since I felt I ought to visit far more often and for longer. She never said it, but I knew she knew that I could make the time. I'd sometimes linger, but then I'd go do what I had to do, hoping that what I could and did not say might be made up for by that small bouquet.
Great, Bruce, thank you. This is a poem, it's a sonnet like last year's winner. It's a very different sonnet. I think this one is probably in a broader sense, much more in the spirit of Rhina, in that it involves an ordinary scene between, no disrespect, Bruce, but ordinary people. And it's seemingly described in an offhand way. And yet you get to the end, and all of a sudden it resonates with great emotion, and it makes you start thinking about larger things. And that's very typical of Rhina's work, and particularly Rhina's sonnets, in my opinion. So it takes great risks with plain, spare language. It has very few adjectives in it. He uses small twice and few once. And it gives you a sense that he's almost trying to minimize the significance of the scene. But that's a setup. In reality, the narrator is wrestling with something important and almost universal, the way most of us misallocate our precious time so that we check boxes in our routines rather than connect with the ones who we love. And the price of this behavior for the people we shortchange tends to be clear and tends to be the focus. And in this case, it's very clear from the beginning that the mother is clearly very lonely. Stopping there would have been easy and would have left probably an okay, but excessively sentimental poem. But that's not what this poem is. What makes this poem worthwhile, in my judgment, is that the way it dwells on the effects on the person who is inattentive. In Bruce's words, how I could and did not say might be made up. That conversational statement of regret, which only starts to say what the narrator wants to say, is what lifts this poem to something special. And unlike so many poems that I read, and I read a lot of them this year, this poem leads the reader to think about the world in a new and important light without ever telling the reader what to think. And for that reason and others, it is now part of the new tradition of winners of the Rhina P. Espaillat Award. Thank you, Bruce, for your great poem.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful poem. It's a wonderful poem because it's so well masked right from the beginning. It starts out as, 10 of the 14 lines are end stopped, which tells you right away, this is a normal narrative. I did this, I did that, and then that happened and so forth. And you sit back comfortably because you're not expecting any bombs, that nothing terrible is going to happen in this poem. But then when you get to could we have lunch, I wasn't free, but that part did not matter. You begin to doubt that. This is more than narrative. There's more going on here than an easy story. And by the time you get to, she never said it, but I knew she knew that I could make the time, you realize you're in dangerous, painful territory. And by the time the end comes, you're quite ready for it. And you're in the poem, not just outside reading the poem. You're in it because you've done this. We all have. We have all, as you said, spent our time wrong. Instead of saying, yes, I care about you very much and I want you to know it, we say, let's go out, let's do this, let's do that. And it's all well meant, but it's not enough. It's not enough. And we know it. So I love this poem because it is full of unspoken self-criticism. And unspoken is a good thing because it takes the sentimentality that could be there out of it. So thank you. This is a wonderful poem.
Thank you, Rhina. Thank you, Mike.
So I've promised Sam that I'm going to try to keep on schedule, which doesn't always come naturally to me. But I want to take a few minutes to spend a little bit more time talking to our poets. They're busy. It's 3 a.m. in Latvia. And, we're very grateful that the three of them are here. So one of does any of you, would any of you like to kick it off? Have a comment or maybe a question for Rhina or anything like that? No?
Yes, I had a question for Rhina, I suppose. And can
I
you
didn't do
hear
it.
me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, she did.
Perhaps perhaps the question is a bit large for this sort of format, but since Rhina, you've had such a long and illustrious career in poetry, and in particular being associated with writing formal poetry and in this sort of formalist poetry, my question is, how do you see the situation in American poetry today for formal poetry? And what do you think about, maybe it's a little bit of a strange question, but what do you think about the sort of future for this sort of formal or formalist writing in the United States?
I'm very optimistic about poetry these days because everything goes, and that's the way I like it. I was very unhappy throughout the poetry wars. I thought that it was an unnecessary battle between people who ought to stick together. After all, so many of the best poets can do both. They can do free verse, they can do formal, they can do strict rhymes, strict everything. And I think that is a wonderful thing. What I tell students is, if you try to decide what you're going to do without knowing all the tools first and how they are used, you're really not making a decision. You're painted yourself into a corner because you don't know what else to do. You can only make a choice when you know the options. And so I tell them, maybe you hate form, but learn it anyway. You're like a carpenter. You have to know what the screws do and what the nails do and what the hammer does and what everything else in that toolbox does. You don't have to use it after you learn it, but you must learn it so that if you throw it out, you will know what you're getting rid of. And I think that ought to work for everybody who has an interest in writing, whatever it is. All of the tools may be used and may not. You're a free agent. But I do believe that the best poets that we have know how to do both. And I think that that's happened. I think that the poetry wars are finally over, and wonderful things are being published in magazines that at one time used to say, no sonnets, please. So.
Sherry, Bruce, anything you want to ask Rhina? Well, yeah, Sherry, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to ask. Thank you for reading Butchering earlier. Changeling is a really important one to me as well, and I love that poem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So my question was just, how do you approach writing about your loved ones who have passed in a way that honors their memory and also respects their privacy? Because that's something I find myself working to do. I find myself trying to honor memory by writing through how I feel about those who have passed. But how do you do that in a way that respects them and respects their privacy as well?
Well, I try to pretend that they're in the room with me, and that I can't say anything that would hurt them at that point. And I don't believe in ghosts or anything of that sort, but I do believe that what they left with us remains with us. We have it. It's not something floating about in the atmosphere. I think that we have to respect that. We have to respect how much they have given us. I think that the dead are in our lives forever. And I have lost so many people, so many by now, starting as a child with exile. The political exile that my parents underwent lost 4 whole families for us. Mother's side, father's side, everything. And you find yourself in a country that you don't really know yet. And you don't know what to do. But what you do is you link the two sides. And I've tried doing that with with translation, and also with linking people together, bringing the Spanish-speaking poets together with the English-speaking poets, and telling everyone that it belongs to all of us. It belongs to everything. Poetry belongs to every human being. It's part of our life. But as far as speaking to the dead, I find it very easy. I find it very easy because they're with me so much.
Good. So we're pretty close to wrapping up. Bruce, do you have a really quick question, or should I move right into the wrap up?
I don't know if this would be a quick question. As I said, I really like very much both the other poems that were chosen. I looked really closely at Eric's poem, and you both said wonderful things about it. I was surprised at how long you had written, had taken to write it. But when I was looking at it, I was noticing, I knew it was a Petrarchan sonnet, but the last, in the sestet, the trees, instruments, blooms, and then they're all singular after that, sea, spent, and perfume. I was just curious whether that was intentional. I mean, it works totally, but from a formal point of view, did you, since you spent so long with the poem, did you have something in mind with that?
It was intentional. I wouldn't say that I had something in particular in mind, but I believe when at some point in the past, some years ago, when I was working on this, I think that not all of those were plural, trees, monuments, and blooms, right, in some previous version. And I simply liked the symmetry of having the final S in the first three lines of the sestet,
Yes.
and then eliminating it in the rhyme so that the rhyme sort of felt very, even though it's not a perfect rhyme, that symmetry makes it feel a little bit more balanced, I would say, in that sense. So that was really my sort of why I kept that, why I added a plural. I don't remember to which word anymore. It's been so many years, but it really was a feeling of wanting that symmetry.
Yes.
There.
And Sherry's poem, I just really wanted to hear her read it. Some of the words were not familiar to me, but it is one of those poems you want to hear. And I was really glad to hear from you, and then a little bit more from Mike. So,
well, I think it's so important for poetry to be heard. It's really not the same on the page. It's like music. It's like a music on the page. You know what it says, but you don't know what it sings. And poetry is singing. It's a kind of singing. So you really do need to hear it. It was a joy to be here with all three of you.
Yes. All right. So I think I'm on cue to start wrapping up. So again, thank you to our three winners. You've done beautiful and important work, and we're grateful for it. Thank you to the Plough editorial board, which obviously did a superb job picking the winners. Think about entering for next year. If I have a suggestion, one of the things you can take from all these poets' work, and a certain number of the poets didn't get the message who submitted this year, is don't try too quickly to tell the reader what to think. Luxuriate in a scene, paint it with care, and present things in a way that make people think about what you want them to think about. Don't jump to telling. Don't be didactic quite so much. I think we saw maybe a little bit too much of that this year. But the top of the poems, I mean, there were so many good poems that didn't make the final cut of 15. I mean, even getting down to 50, you twist a little bit, and I've been on the other side of this, and so I ache a little bit every time. I pull one out of the pile and that grammatical error, and I can't do it with that, that kind of thing. But this is, I think, a wonderful contest. It's wonderful because it honors Rhina. Plough has worked very hard to avoid perception of, at least of cronyism in a lot of these contests, and they've worked very hard to keep the cost of the contest down. And we all do this as volunteers. We're not paying any celebrity judges, and certainly not paying me either. And so it's a real group effort for the love of poetry. So I think it's a great grassroots competition for poets to enter. I think everybody but me is very pleased that we went from about 500 entrants to 750, because, I have to read them all. But it would be a great thing for Plough and for poetry to have even more people next year. And so if you're out there listening to this, think about a talented friend who maybe has been turned off about entering contests, or hasn't heard about Plough yet, or that type of thing. Reach out to some people for us and help us make next year as great as these first two competitions. I'm really looking forward to seeing 3 more winners next year as good as these 3. So thank you on behalf of Plough. Thank you for listening tonight. Thank you again to our 3 poets, and most of all, thank you to the great Rhina Espaillat for everything that she does. Good night.
Good night.
Thank
Thank you.
everyone.
Thanks to Plough. Yes.
Eric, go to bed.
Yes.
I will. Thank you very much.